Hello, and welcome to episode 191 of Quarkus Insights. We're going to be talking about the Quarkus testing landscape with Eric Deandrea. And before we do anything else, I have to do like the really terrible thing, which is to tell you why we're a minute late starting. And the reason we're a minute late starting is because Quinoa was showing us his rabbit. And now it's sort of, I don't make the rules, but now you all know that there was something really exciting that we all saw. That
Yeah, but it's only one of the rabbits.
only one of the rabbits.
Yeah, you should do that Vantage again. We got a tour of Clement's floor and under the desk and all that.
No, but then you will see my terrible keyboard management skills. So.
Oh yeah, that's the trade-off, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like, you get the points for the rabbit, but then you lose all the points for cable management.
I would say that people are asking for the rabbit now. You got to show the rabbit.
Yeah, we're trying to figure out if we did like an episode of Quarkus Insights where it was just pet show and like all of the presenters brought in, their dogs and cats. Oh yay, we're getting it. Oh, a little bit lower. We can just see like the top. Oh, so cute. Okay, best episode ever. Doesn't matter what you do, Eric.
Sorry. It's nap time. It's the beginning of the afternoon, so yeah, she's not going to be running before a couple of hours.
Yeah, is it warm under there? Have you got like sort of computer heat under there?
No. She's directly on the floor.
Now, what you're supposed to say is no, because it's right next to the computer, but my computer is running Quarkus, so it doesn't generate any.
Yeah, well, with the work I'm doing right now, it generates a lot of heat, which is good because it's winter time, but yeah.
And that's the other Quarkus principle, isn't it? Is like Clement suffers so that you don't have to.
Yeah, but
actually, I got the fans to spin. I thought my laptop was going to take off into outer space the other day. I was running Llama 3.3 on locally through Ollama, and the thing was like... All the GPU fans were going crazy.
Yeah, I never hear mine anymore. It's really good. I assume it does something at some point, but spot the person who's not doing much of Llama at the moment.
When do you actually have time to write any code, Holly? You've been like all globetrotting for the last quarter.
I have, yeah. I have to say I haven't written that much code last quarter, but it's all going to change this quarter. This quarter, I'm going to do... Yes, this is going to lead us neatly into your topic, actually, because this quarter is the quarter that I finished the test class loading rewrite, which will mean that Quarkus testing, it sort of unlocks the ability for Quarkus testing to be even better than it is now, but it's still pretty cool now. So,
yeah, I've got a couple places in my slides to razz you.
So what are you going to talk about today, Eric?
I'm going to talk about testing because you know my obsession, but I thought I would start by talking a little bit about like why I have the obsession. Like, well, I shouldn't say everybody knows, but people on the team and internally here know about my obsession. Do you want to bring those slides up?
Yeah.
So for those who don't know me, my name's Eric Deandrea. I've been here before, both as a guest and a host. I help pitch in. I kind of feel like, when we watch the local news and it's like, who's that anchor? I've never seen that anchor before. That's like the B crew. So that I kind of see myself as the B crew when the A crew is not available. I'm on here. Although it's kind of weird. I was saying in our back channel, like every time I've been the guest here, like it's always like the C crew that's here for me. Like, so
yeah, as a host, yeah, I'm definitely the C crew, like, even D.
Yeah, so like I think it's the first time I've been the guest, and Holly, you've actually been here as the host. Usually,
yeah, I was starting to worry that you were thinking I was avoiding you because like every time you were a guest, it was like, oh, I'm sorry, I need to like brush my hair or travel to Australia or something,
or play with my dog or cat or whatever. Yeah, so for those who don't know me, I work for Red Hat. I'm not an engineer on the Quarkus project, but I do contribute to it in a lot of the community projects. Like Quarkus, formerly in a previous life, I did a lot with Spring and Spring Boot. I help run my local Java users group here in the Boston area. So I'm based on the East Coast of the US, just north of Boston. I'm a Java champion. I've written books, or I shouldn't say books, plural, singular book. I'm trying to figure out There we go. Yeah. So I wrote this book a couple of years ago. Whether or not there's another edition that's going to come out, we've been trying to get that going for like 2 years now. Just budget is the question. I can't see or react to the chat. So if there are any questions, just say what they are, Holly.
I'm sorry to tell you that so far all of the questions and comments are about Clemo's rabbit.
Okay.
Predictable.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to be busy, kind of like you, for the next couple of weeks. So this week I'm doing a Jug meetup. I'm talking about LangChain4j and Quarkus with the Central Iowa Java users group. And then next week I'm traveling north to Canada, and I'm going to be in person in Ottawa and Montreal, talking about LangChain4j, Quarkus, Spring, test-driven development, the Java Champions Conference, which I think you're doing too, Holly. I think I'm moderating your session, so we'll be there together. And then I'll be at JFocus in February. I'm doing a talk with Oleg from Docker on testing. You kind of see where the obsession is going here. Testing non-deterministic things. I'll be at DevNexus in Atlanta. So I figured I'd talk about like why I have this obsession. And I don't know if you even know this, Holly. I don't know that we've ever talked about it, but I love this quote. And this quote isn't just about software or testing. It's just about life in general. Like the more you own, the more it owns you. I find it to be true, like with pretty much everything in life. The more stuff you accumulate, just the more time it takes for you to do whatever it needs to do to manage that stuff. So for me, when I like my daily work, because I don't actually work in an engineering organization. I don't want to say marketing. I don't actually work in an engineering organization. So a lot of my day job involves like I work on like tons and tons of like different projects. And a lot of the projects I build it once and then just kind of keep it up to date because it's like for a demo or a talk or something like that. And then I have to revisit it a little bit later on. Or, when Clement breaks something, I have to go in and fix what he breaks or what he didn't think about. But for me, the biggest thing is keeping stuff up to date, because when I go on the road or I do talks and I build these demos, I don't want them like you build it once and then, Quarkus moves so fast, like in 3 months, it would be like, dude, that's like so yesterday, like it's so out of date. So keep making sure things are kept up to date. And that's kind of my biggest workflow. And it works out great because there's this tool out there on GitHub called Dependabot, which is really awesome at keeping things up to date. I'm not going to talk much about it, but if you're not familiar with Dependabot and GitHub and GitHub Actions and automation, you should definitely go look at it. It makes it really easy to keep things up to date until you have lots of projects. So this was an actual screenshot that I when I got it into work one morning, I think it was like back in December, right before Christmas. Like this was my inbox. Like, hey, we bumped this version of this version of that, and you can see there's like lots and lots of different projects. So there's just not enough time in the day to kind of deal with that. So I don't know, Holly, you probably remember this slide from a talk that we did a while back, focused on having confidence in distributed systems, and that when you deploy different things, that things aren't going to break. But I kind of find that this holds true in my case as well, where you need to make sure that if you don't want to have to spend your time like making sure dependency update didn't break something, you got to get really good at testing and you got to get really good at automation. So I keep finding that this slide that we talked about holds true. But kind of like the previous slide, there's a lot of noise and there's not a lot of time, and I don't really want to deal with all that noise because I don't want to treat those updates as cats, even though I love cats and cats are my favorite animal. Sorry, Clement, your rabbit is cute, but I'm more of a cat person. I don't want to waste the time. This is kind of what I'd rather see. I'd rather see my inbox and it's more of a, hey, I did this, I'm just letting you know, versus a laundry list of things that, oh God, when am I actually going to get to do any work? Because I'd rather it just do it on its own. So I know this topic is a little more DevOpsy and you need to do some setup on GitHub. I'm not going to talk about how I do like all the auto commits and auto checking and stuff. We can we're interested in that, I can do another talk on that, or I can deep dive on that another time. It's not really part of today, but essentially I've got any GitHub repo that I do, I have a new template that I use. So whenever I create a new repo, I'm doing it from that template, which has auto merging capabilities, and it has to set up certain rules within the repository to force things. So like when a pull request comes in, as long as the checks pass, it will auto merge the thing. So I don't even have to do it because I like to be completely hands off, and I have confidence that, it's all about confidence. I have confidence that, I might not have 100% test coverage, but I'm pretty confident that what I wrote in the tests that I wrote in my various repositories, if the tests pass, it's not going to be broken. There are times like, if we can talk about AI and non-deterministic, where things just break and you have no control over it. That's a topic that I'm building a new talk for JFocus about, and how to get around that. But this is kind of where my use cases become the same as everybody else's, where it's all about having confidence in whatever it is that you're building, whether you're building a demo, whether you're building an application that's mission critical, whether you're doing high frequency trading, it doesn't really matter. You need to have confidence in the system. And having confidence means finding the right balance between the risk and the time spent writing tests, right? I mean, you could write tests that do all kinds of crazy things, and we have them, and I'm going to show them because we want to show how to do them. But you need to be able to find that balance between how much risk are you willing for and how much time do you actually want to spend writing the tests. So for me, it would be like awful to show up to, like, I'm going to go to user groups next week, whip out my demo, find out like Quarkus updated or something. Quarkus never breaks anything, but other dependencies got updated. And now my demo's broken. And so rather than talking about whatever it is I'm supposed to talk about, it's, they're watching me debug and try to figure out what's broken. That's not fun.
And you just know that if there's going to be one place that you're going to get broken, it's just when you stand up in front of like 100 people at a user group.
Yeah. So that's kind of where my obsession comes from. And it pertains to how I work and and kind of my workflow. So I figured I'd share that a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about how, like the different things. So what I'm going to kind of do, I'm going to start kind of simple and build up like different types of tests. And all these tests, I'm going to use the superheroes. So everything I'm showing is right in the superheroes. It's stuff that exists today. As I'm doing it, you might see, or you might start to think, hey, that seems like too trivial to test, or that seems too brittle, or, you and I have had plenty of conversations about how much is too much, and, that risk reward balance. A lot of what's here is to show how you would do it, because it's a demo and a sample application, and it's kind of the sample and demo application for Quarkus. So we kind of went a little overboard, or at least I went a little overboard when I wrote a lot of these tests, but it's just more to show. When I do my own little sample or my own demos, I don't go as crazy, but I use, and I have, there's a point of, like I said, there's that fine line of risk versus reward. Like, how much time do I want to spend writing the tests versus how much benefit do I get from it? So if we look at kind of the normal stuff, I talk about unit testing, and this is where, in the old school, I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. People traditionally felt that a unit test was like a class. So, you would test a class in isolation from any other. Generally speaking, I don't think a test or a unit test has to be just a class. The word unit can be whatever you define it to be, whether it's like some submodule, or it could very well be a class. It could be a collection of classes. It could be a package, whatever. But it's up to you to decide what that unit is. And these principles probably sound familiar, but using mocking and spying so that you're testing that thing in isolation, and then you're testing all the potential outcomes of that particular unit. Whereas with the integration testing, you want to treat your application as a black box, and which also means you need your downstream services. So, Quarkus and dev services and whatnot, kind of, we had that slide in the same deck where I don't have it in front of me, but it kind of if you look at the testing pyramid, it kind of, Quarkus kind of blurs the lines between unit and integration testing with the dev services and being able to spin up the containers and whatnot. So in the past, what you might consider an integration test, I typically sometimes, or most of the time, will consider a unit test. But when you're talking about integration tests, these services really need to be there, right? Because you're treating your application as a black box. And what I find is most important is your application or whatever it is that you're building should be run and tested as it's intended to be deployed. I find so many times where like I'll just do my JVM tests and then I'll go to do a demo and I'll compile it to native or run it in a container and the thing breaks because of something. Like there's some reflection, or I needed to register something for reflection, or I needed a runtime hint, or something breaks. And so in your test suite, when you're running your integration test, making sure that you're running your tests as the thing is intended to be deployed. So whether it's on the JVM or native or containers or whatever. And I find a lot of people don't do that. Mocking. So, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. Everybody kind of understands what mocking is. You're defining fake things where you define the interactions, and then you can do verification. But what I like to talk a little bit about is that these things don't necessarily have to be object based. And what I mean by that, so like with something like Mockito, you're mocking objects and you're defining interactions on objects. But when you're writing tests, you can kind of take that same concept and bring it up so that you're like talking about connections between systems, or between your application and dependent services. So you don't necessarily have to keep this mocking at an object level. It can be at a system level as well. So a lot of the testing concepts apply to systems. So kind of what I'm going to dig in and show. I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time on time. So Bruno is asking, you mentioned your PRs are automatically merged. What if the PR removes tests? Well, then it would automatically merge. So if I remove tests as part of the PR build would run to success. There's a fine line between because you have to set up in order to know like what tests are required, what checks are required. You have to do some rules, and you have to turn on like branch protection rules and all that kind of stuff. So there comes a time like you have a check, maybe you change your CI and you change your checks around a little bit. So it's not completely hands off in that case. Like your checks might pass, but then you have to, once you merge that PR, you've got to go adjust your rules a little bit. So there's some manual merging, but as long as your tests fall into the workflow, like if I have a workflow that just says like build test JVM Java 21, as long as whatever tests encompass that workflow, then as long as that workflow passes, then GitHub is happy and Dependabot is happy. If we have time at the end, I hope we have time, but I've got a lot of stuff here. If we have time, I can show kind of how all that stuff works.
One of the things is that it's not every PR that gets merged automatically. It's PR that has been opened by people you trust. So either you or Dependabot. So things that normally should not delete tests or leak secrets or those kind of things.
Yeah. So that's a good point. For me, most of my repository, I have a couple of exceptions, but most of my repositories, it's just talking about Dependabot. So it's only dependency updates auto merge themselves. I do have another repo where it's a repository of code for like a workshop. So I have like the base branch, and then I have other branches, which are feature branches, but they're kind of like the end result of what a user would build throughout the thing. So if we make a change to the base, it will, as long as the tests pass and I merge it doesn't auto merge, but it'll actually apply those changes automatically to the PR, to the other feature branches. It'll run the checks, and if those pass, it'll auto merge that. So that way it's like a waterfall. If I add new functionality to like the main branch and I have downstream branches, it'll fall automatically as long as all the tests pass.
Oh, and we've got another question about managing it as well. So Kevin asks, you can use Jacoco that the code coverage is not dropping. Which
you could. I'm not, but yeah. You could.
I was doing some PRs to a project I depended on recently, and they had like really strict rules in terms of for every PR you had to not drop the code coverage. And it's a whole different thing, but it's one of those things that's, to me, seems like a really good idea. But then the net effect was that some of my refactorings made the code better, but dropped the code coverage. And so then the incentive really was for me to not do the refactoring, because it created a whole bunch more work for me. So you have to be sort of careful with some of these computer says no metrics.
Or you're inventing tests that are meaningless just to get the code coverage up.
Yeah.
and when you have very high coverage, typically that's what we have in Mutiny. Because of the test we're running, or sometimes we're testing race conditions. Well, testing that race condition do not happen. The coverage can be slightly different from one to another one because it depends on the timing of the system. So you can't really apply such kind of rules when you have a very high test coverage with some tests that can slightly differ from one to another. But yeah, when you are in that game, your coverage is very high. We have something like 93, 94%.
Yeah, so like we have with the superheroes, for example, we use Sonar Cloud, so just the public Sonar Cloud instance, and we publish for anytime there's a check-in to main. We only do it for the main branch, but we check in and we run all the different microservices and we run all the coverage. So we're running, in one we've got like 75%, 80%, 90%, 100%. We've got very high coverage, except for the UI. The UI is interesting because, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this as well as part of my talk here, but the UI uses Quinoa and it uses React combined with Quarkus. And so the React has its own set of tests that run with Jest, and then the backend has its own tests that run with JUnit and whatnot. And this is actually a combination of the metrics between Jest and the Java. So it's like a whole holistic across the entire thing. But I'll dive into this a little bit more and I'll show how we do that as well, because Quinoa and testing and Playwright is something I definitely want to talk about because it's one of the cool things, and it's one of the things that I find is really good. You get a lot of value with little effort, and it gives you pretty good confidence on how things work. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. So if we look at these and go kind of deep dive a little bit into some of these tests here. So we've got the simple stuff, and oops, what happened here? Things just went haywire. That's weird. I think my screen just went completely blank here.
Oh, it's still looking okay to us. I think.
Yeah, I don't know what the hell just happened here.
We see your mouse with you.
Yeah, it's weird. So I've got a split screen. I've got another monitor, and my other monitor just went crazy. And I don't know why. We were just talking about computer setups and third world problems before. All right, so I'll talk a little bit about some things as I've been doing this and some things that I find as good practices. And I think a big and the most important one is this test port. By default, when you run Quarkus on its tests, it runs on port 8081. I find that if you set the test port to 0, that tells Quarkus to run on a random port. And I've run into issues where either in GitHub, it runs a test and 8081 is taken for some reason, or the test pass, but when I deploy it somewhere, hell breaks loose. I didn't want to say the other 4-letter word, that begins with an S. I find letting it pick random ports whenever you run any tests is a good thing, because now you're not stuck on, or you're not writing any code that's fixed on a particular port. So that's kind of the first thing. It's in my template whenever I build a new project is I always set test port to random port.
It's actually not 0. It's any numbers 0 and every negative number. And why is that? Because if you use 0 and then you reference that port 0 somewhere else, we will remember that it's the actual port that has been assigned to 0. And if you do -1, then you can also have a client which is using -1, which will resolve against that -1 and so on. But it's something we want to revisit because this is very obscure, even if it works. So, yeah.
Yep, as if I didn't even know that. So I learned something new.
Nor me.
Learned something new.
So if it's a hard balance to find, because yes, it's very convenient, but at the same time, we want something easy to use that doesn't look like a DNS server running on the side. So, yeah.
Yep. All right. So if we look at just kind of simple mocking and spying, with Quarkus, if you want to mock. So in this case, this is a test of the service layer within the fights. So if we're looking at the superheroes, we've got the fight service here, and it has REST and gRPC connections to other services down here. So when I'm writing my test for the service layer, I'm mocking the client classes for the downstream services. good question on Pierre. Removing tests for auto-merge. Okay. And then being able to just kind of test the thing that I want to test. So in this case, it's a little bit more than what most people would consider a unit test, because I've got messaging in here. I've got like 4 downstream clients in here. So it's not like just testing a single class. It's testing my kind of my business layer, and I'm treating the layers as the units here. And you can see there's a lot of kind of good stuff in here. We can talk about this in-memory connector. So when I run this class or this application talks to these downstream services, but when you actually perform the fight, it puts the result on a Kafka topic, which is listened to by another application that keeps track of the statistics of winners and losers and whatnot. So being able to do things like, hey, I want to perform a fight. I get my outcome where the hero should win. I create my stuff. I'm going to mock my database, and I'm going to do some mocking at the class level, but then I'm going to perform the fight. And then I want to make sure that the message appears on the Kafka topic. But in this case, I'm not actually using a real Kafka broker. I'm using in-memory. I've kind of mocked the Kafka broker with an in-memory channel. Clement's probably familiar. I think you wrote this, didn't you? This in-memory connector stuff.
Long time ago, yeah.
Long time ago, yeah. So you can define a sync, and then you can wait for messages to appear in the sync, and then get the result of the messages, and verify that everything is good. And so
Clement suffers so we don't have to.
Yeah, Clement again suffers so that we don't have to. And then this is kind of one of those things where you do like verification that methods were called, and some people would think that this is brittle, and I sometimes tend to agree, but like I said, it's a sample application, so this is really here to show how you would do it, and that you can do it if you want to do it. If I'm writing my own test for my own application, would I do this? Probably not. The only time I might do it is if it's like a class, my code calls like a third-party API that I don't have control over. I just want to make sure my stuff enters their stuff with the right parameters, right? That it called their method with the parameters that were what I expected it to. What it does from there, I don't really care, right? So that's it. But then also being able to test like the inverse side. So I do a lot of negative testing as well. So it's one thing to write a test that things work the way it's supposed to, but like I'm doing input validation here at the service layer, that the inputs were actually correct, and making sure that it does the right thing. And again, you might think that this is too low level, like looking at the constraint violation API, and then it has the right messages, and it might be too low level. Maybe just had an error is good enough. But again, this is kind of went down a path and did a lot of detail just to show that you could do it and how you would do it if you wanted to do it. The other kind of cool thing that's in here is Quarkus profiles, which I don't know how many people are familiar with this. So this service class, for example, if we look at the code, there's timeouts and fallbacks and resiliency and all that good stuff. But there's some methods here where generate random image, right? So where it actually talks to the narration service, which then talks to an AI, which this could take, for image generation, this could take up to 30 seconds. And so when I write my tests, I don't want to, if I'm doing positive and negative testing, that takes a long time, like 30 seconds to test that it actually, like I want to have the backend actually time out. So a test that my timeout works. So in this case, I created a profile called my shorter timeouts, which I reuse, where you can control the values of all these fallbacks and timeouts and circuit breakers and all that stuff. So I can set them to much shorter periods of time so that I don't have to wait for 30 seconds for the thing to actually fail, right? So that's cool. So with the test profile is a way where for a particular test class, you can override configuration for a particular test class. So, usually it uses, whatever the test profile configuration in your application properties. Here, using a test profile, you can override it. But kind of the side effect of this, like everything has a trade-off, is, like when you run like Maven Verify or Quarkus test or continuous testing or whatever, it starts Quarkus once and runs all the tests and then closes. When you start doing stuff like this, it actually has to close the application and restart the application with the new configuration. So that's kind of like the downside of doing this. All right, does that make sense? All right, so that's profiles, that's mocking, spying, Mockito, all that good stuff. So let's go on to, so in our resource class, we're using, this is all based on Java 21, so we're using virtual threads, right? Run on virtual threads. And we could have a whole nother discussion, Clement, about whether you should make all your endpoints use virtual threads or not. You know, this.
Well, the answer is no.
Yeah.
Sure,
it doesn't have to be a long debate. It's no.
Yeah, so that's a different discussion for a different day, and you can shame me on a different meeting another time. But again, this is a demo application, so we put it on here to show what you can do. But what you can also do when you write your tasks is you can use the virtual thread test package, and you can enforce that your code doesn't pin the carrier thread. So that way, like if any of the stuff that you're doing here pins a carrier thread, the test will fail.
I think Clement wrote that as well, didn't he?
Yep.
He did.
Yeah.
Clement suffers so that we don't have to.
Yeah. The funny thing is, I needed to see where we were pinning in Quarkus. So I actually needed that to understand where we were pinning when we were doing GPA and Ariana and things like that, and fix all this pinning. That's actually why there is also the should pin with the number of pinning events you expect, because sometimes the time my patches goes in and get released, it takes some time. So that's why there is a two annotation.
Yep.
Unfortunately, right now, this annotation use GFR recording under the hood to see the pinning, and it takes couple of seconds, or on my machine. So on Eric's Super M4, it's probably a couple of milliseconds, but on my machine, it's a couple of seconds to set up, which is unfortunate. I didn't find any other solution. If you have any ideas, I'm more than happy to discuss.
Yeah, so to use that, you bring in the virtual threads dependency, and the only other kind of setup you got to do, and there's a whole guide and blog post about this, yes. But you have to set your Surefire, and you have to turn on the trace pin.
No, actually, you don't have to do that.
You don't have to do that?
No. You can do it. Then you have two signals, but you don't have to do this anymore.
Oh.
I just based everything on the GFR recording, so I get more details than in the stack, because I know where, I know how, I know the kind of pinning, if it's because of native, if it's because of synchronized, and things like that.
Yep. So update the documentation because it still shows that in the documentation. All right. So again, I learned something else new. All right. So that's there. Let's talk a little bit about integration testing, right? So I have all these awesome unit tests. Oops, that's in the, use my tests here. Source main, source test. Sorry, my screen is like yay big so that everybody else can see it. So when I look at my integration tests, so this is more kind of how I do things, not necessarily the right way to do it. So when I write an integration test, so this application is just a RESTful application, REST requests come in, it's got a database backend, and then the responses go out. With Quarkus integration test, if you're not using this, you should. This will actually, when you run Maven Verify, will run based on how you're deploying your application. So if I have a container image extension in my POM. If I say, -d quarkus.containerimage.build equals true, and I run Maven Verify, it'll build a container image and it'll run the integration tests against the running container. If I do, -p native, it'll build a native image, and then it'll run that native image and it'll run the integration tests. So with integration tests, now you can't do mocking and stubbing. You can't do bean injection. You can't do any of that stuff. Your application, you want to interact with it as if it's like you're a client of your application. So what I typically like to do, and again, this might not be how everybody does it, but the pattern I typically follow is I write my tests in an order. And you'll generally say, well, your test should be idempotent. It shouldn't care about an order. But when you're doing things that involve state, because you think about, if I do a post that creates state, rather than have to wipe everything out excuse me, wipe everything out and then start over at the beginning of each test, I basically treat my test class as a scenario, right? So I'll start and I'll order it by the order annotation. So I'll start with all the stuff that doesn't care about state, and those will all have the first order. So like anything that's read, get, where it doesn't involve any kind of state change, run those, and they can run in whatever order. I don't really care. But then you start getting to things that do that aren't item potent or that will mutate stuff. Let me find one here. Yeah. So then I increase the order. So now I'm gonna add an item. So now I'm adding, so I'm verifying that post works. And then my next test assumes that I've already added something. So now I'm going to like update that thing and make sure the state is okay. And then I'm going to do some gets after that and verify that it did what I wanted to do. So that's kind of how I write my integration tests.
It's a total trade-off, isn't it, between that really sort of pure idea of independence and the execution speed of your tests.
Yeah. Because otherwise I'd have to find a way to inject a connection to my database, which isn't easy in an integration test, right? Because you can't just inject your persistence layer, your repository class and just call delete all. You can't do that in an integration test. So someone's asking, what would the ratio of Quarkus test to Quarkus integration test? So I'd say this is kind of one of those. It depends on your risk reward. If I'm doing like a one-off, I'm doing like a simple demo application where I'm just building it once, it's to show off a couple times, and I just want to keep it up to date, I typically find I write more integration tests than I do unit tests. Because especially and I'll talk about Playwright in a second, if the thing has a user interface and I interact with it from the user outside the application and everything works, then for a dependency update, I'm pretty happy that it works. So for those instances, I tend to write more integration tests. For if it's like a system that other people are going to come in and contribute to or going to use, then I tend to write more Quarkus tests than integration tests. That's
and the pattern that we follow a lot in the Quarkus code base and in the integration tests that we have in the Quarkus code base is that you have an inheritance relationship between them. So you'd have your Quarkus test, and then you have your Quarkus integration test inherit from the Quarkus test. And then sometimes that will work really well. And then sometimes if you've got injection, it's a complete catastrophe. So then you put the annotation on to say, actually, no, I didn't want this to run.
Yeah, I don't like that pattern at all. To be honest, I don't like that pattern. And I don't follow that pattern. And of course, I mean, there are times when I do use that pattern, but for the most part, I don't. And the reason I don't is because I do a lot of mocking and spying and stuff, and you can't do that in integration tests. So I'd be overriding all the methods anyway. Plus, my pattern of my unit tests aren't necessarily following a scenario. They're testing specific pieces of functionality, where the pattern I usually follow with my integration test is a scenario. So for me, it doesn't work. For others, it might be fine, but I typically don't like that pattern.
Is it for the other way around, though? I'm trying to think, because most integration tests you would be able to run as a Quarkus test, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
And then you get the faster feedback. So you wouldn't want every integration test to inherit. You wouldn't want every Quarkus test to have a friend that was an integration test, but the other way around.
Yeah. For the classes that are on the outside of your application from the entry point, like in this case, it's a REST entry point. So you could do that. You could write your integration test and have your unit tests inherit that, and that would work fine. But it would also mutate the state for any other Quarkus tests, right? Because it's a shared database. If you're running under Surefire in continuous testing or in dev mode or whatever, once that scenario ran and mutated your data, now your database is mutated for other unit tests as well. Which is why I like to use mocking and spying and all that kind of stuff. So it's part of it for me is personal preference. Part of it, is it the best way to do it? Maybe, maybe not. But for the way I work, it works. All right. Any other questions about that? So I talked about profiles. Oh, we've also got the test resource lifecycle manager. So let's look at that a little bit. And so I'll talk a little bit about WireMock and because I like WireMock a lot, and a lot of the stuff that's in here, there is a Quarkus extension for WireMock now, which makes a lot of the stuff a whole lot easier. But a lot of this was written before that extension was available. So there's actually a mix of it, which I think is kind of good in the superheroes. There's some stuff that does it the old way, and there's some stuff that uses the WireMock extension. So for example, in the fight service, if we kind of go back to our architecture diagram, in the fight service, talks downstream to these other 4 services. I have, when I run my tests, I want to use WireMock to stub the responses so that I don't necessarily have to have those downstream services up when I run my tests. And using the Quarkus test resource lifecycle manager is the way to do that. So whenever you're integrating some third-party product into your test. Now, the downside with this is you don't get this in dev mode. It's just when you run your tests and integration tests. But I can start a WireMock server. I can format it. I can update my configuration based on what the thing is doing. So in this case, it uses Stork. So it's setting the static address list for Stork to point to WireMock. And then you create this annotation where you can inject you create an annotation like inject WireMock that you can then inject in your test. So for example, here, if I find where do I actually use this thing? I don't know off the top of my head. All right. So like when I test my client, my downstream, my REST client, I say, with test resource, WireMock, and then I can say inject WireMock, and I can actually inject the WireMock server here, which is the third-party library, right? It's not my own code. It's, from, Tom Akehurst. And then I can do things like, I can, for each method I want to do a stub. You could like create a mapping file and drop the mapping file in source test resources. But in this case, like where I do a lot of negative testing, like I want to test, I have success, but I also have an error. I get a 500, I get a 404. I want to test that things behave properly. Where I inject like a delay in the request, which is something really cool that you can do with WireMock. So then you can verify that you did that. Is there a good capture feature in WireMock? You test against the real server, but capture mocks to replay later. I think you can do. I haven't done that, but I think you can. I think there is a way to do it. And if it can be done programmatically in the API, I don't know. I'd have to go read the WireMock docs. I don't know off the top of my head.
Same. I feel like it's there, but I also feel like I haven't used it myself.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's there. So again, this is a good way to do this. The Quarkus extension for WireMock though is very cool. We use it in the narration service. The cool thing about the Quarkus extension for WireMock is it has a dev service. So now when you're running in dev mode, you can actually serve stubs. So
that's really cool.
Yeah, so we use it in the narration service. And if you look at the narration service up on the top here, it's an application that uses LangChain4j, and it can talk to OpenAI or Azure OpenAI. So when we built the system here, every single one of these applications you can run standalone without any dependency on any downstream service whatsoever, and the application is guaranteed to work, right? And so the way we do it, and we showcase different technologies for different services, like I'll show Microx in a minute. For the fight service, we use Microx, but the narration service, we use the WireMock dev service for that. And what we do is we provide just a static JSON, and I coded this by going, the WireMock cloud has a stub for OpenAI, right? So I just put in my own parameters and then downloaded the JSON from there. And that's how I got this JSON. You put the JSON in here and you have like your request matchers. And so when your application issues requests that match anything here, it'll, rather than make the real request, it'll actually return the stub that you've hard coded. So now you don't have to be hooked into OpenAI or anything. It'll serve, but it serves the same request every time, right? The same response every time, which is, for what I'm doing, is fine. And then you can use this by doing, where is it here? REST, narration resource. Where do I do it? It's in here somewhere. Yeah, here. So in my integration tests, because I also want to do negative testing, right? Well, what happens if OpenAI blows up? I want to make sure my code handles that. So you can inject this connect WireMock, and then you can just inject the WireMock instance, which is the same thing we were doing before, and then you can do whatever you want with it, right? You can create stubs. Where is it here? Yeah, you can, I think I use it in a base class. Yeah, so I can verify that it's a successful thing. I can do stubbing in my tests, but it'll actually run in dev mode too. It'll serve the requests in dev mode. So if you've got like Swagger UI, you can actually see the requests happening. So that's pretty cool.
And actually, just going back to the question of capturing, because I've put in PRs to a project that I think was using the WireMock capture to generate the test stubs, because they were so detailed. And so again, it's the trade-off of it's easy to generate those because you just capture, but then when you want to add something new, in order to figure out what you need to change to do your negative testing or your other scenario, you have to wade through loads and loads of headers and stuff that's not in any way relevant to your test. So it might be one of those ones where you want to kind of bootstrap with the capture, but then really quickly get yourself down to just the minimum set that you need, because that's going to be so much more tractable going forward.
Yep. Yeah, and I can show like the microcs, for example. Like, so if I go and if I were to actually, where's my fight? So if I were to actually start this Quarkus dev clean, Maven's going to download the internet. I should have done that first. Yeah, so when dev mode starts up, of course, like I said, I'm in the middle of setting up a new machine. So it's going to download all the container image. So when that's done, we'll come back to that. Luckily, I've got I've got like a 1.5 gigabit internet connection here. Microx is starting. Actually, there was a bug in the Microx thing, so I may not be able to show this because I'm using their nightly image, and I'm working with Laurent on this. Yeah. So essentially what this would do, if you kind of look at the properties file, so the Microx has a dev service, right? And so when you, where is it here? Microx. So the dev service, in dev mode, I enable the dev service. And because the whole Superheroes project is a kind of an Uber repo. They're not modules, but it's like in one big repo, and all of the apps that have their open API, not OpenAI, open API documents. I can point to all the open API documents from all the other applications, as well as we also use gRPC. So there's a Postman collection for all the gRPC stuff. When the Microx dev service loads, it'll read all this and it'll put it into Microx and expose it on some paths and ports. And so, for example, here, like when I put in, okay, here's my hero service. When I run it in dev mode, I can say go to the Microx host port. And so Microx will actually serve the examples from my open API documents. So that way my application can run in standalone mode. Again, you get the same response every time, but it allows you to kind of put yourself in isolation and be able to run without the downstream dependencies, which is cool. And it works for, I'm not using it yet, but you can do like asynchronous messaging and Kafka and all that good stuff too. So Microx is pretty cool. Yeah. All right, so that's Microx. I know we've got, 10 minutes. I want to jump to some fun stuff here.
Yay.
Yeah, I want to jump to some. So I've got a whole bunch of other stuff. If you're looking to test like WebSocket servers, all that's in here too. A pattern that I use, but I really want to get to some fun stuff. So you probably recognize this slide, Holly. And this is where I'm supposed to shame you because you haven't fixed stuff from 2 years later. It's now 2025, and some of the stuff is still broken, right? It's class loading stuff.
Yeah, so it's not broken. It just needs some enhancements.
Yeah. So if we look at contract testing, so without having to go into full details of what contract testing is, you come see our talk or watch the replay of our hour-long talk to talk about contract testing. But essentially, you've got producers and consumers, right? So on the back end, you've got these downstream services, and then you've got a service that consumes it. So having contract tests means that being able to have confidence that in your system that if I make a change to either one of the producers and one of the consumers, that when I go to deploy them, things are going to be good, right? And so what we do here in our fight service is we'll use Pact, which is a contract testing framework, and we'll stub out mock servers for the heroes, the villains, the narration, and the location services. And this is running not just like, because you got to be careful and not to just test Pact itself. Like if you did it at the client layer, like if I just took my villains client and I hooked Pact up to it, well, all I'm doing is testing that the mock server did what it was supposed to. So in this case, I'm actually testing that, hey, if I say, find me some random fighters, I'm actually going to call my business logic to find random fighters and assert that I got what I expected to get. But under the covers, it's actually using the contract's mock server to serve the different requests. And so I can have different contracts in this case for, let me find one here. So like for where the consumer is the fight service and the there's not hello rent yeah so where I have a bunch of different scenarios where I ask for random fighters, which will make parallel calls from fights to heroes and villains, wait for both of them to finish because they can be run asynchronously, get the results, and then combine them. So I want to make sure that if I say find random fighters, I test the scenario where both of them return success, but then maybe where one of them returns an error or a timeout or something, or both of them return an error or timeout to make sure that my code doesn't break. So I have different contracts for testing with different states. For those, I don't want to have to deep dive into Pact here, but I can say there's a state on the provider that says no villain is there. That's something that you should be able to handle. What that means for the provider is up to the provider to decide. But there's a state where I ask for something and something doesn't exist, and I need to be able to handle that as the consumer of that. And then there's, go ahead.
I was just going to add, so it's solving a similar problem to Microx, but solving it in a kind of a different way and with different trade-offs.
Yeah. So this is more on the consumer-driven. The Microx has contract testing, but it's more on the provider side. I honestly haven't played with the Microx contract testing, so I can't really talk much about it. But here I can set up different contracts between fights, villains, between fights and heroes, and we're actually doing gRPC because the location service is gRPC based. We're actually using the Pact gRPC plugin to generate gRPC contracts, and I can show you that. Let me find it here. Yeah, so I can say using the protobuf plugin, I expect to receive this, and this is how you would do it. It's more like coding logic in a map, like telling it what the contract is like, but you can point it to your protobuf file. So my protobuf file is here. This is the content type. This is the service I want to call in the gRPC. If I have any request parameters, this is what's in the request, and this is what I should get back in the response. And I'm pretty loose because this is just like this one's a hello request. This is, I'm going to get back a payload that has a name that matches some regular expression, a picture that matches some regular expression. And then I can write my tests as if I would write my test. There's a question about mutation tests. I haven't divin down that. I know there are some people who have done it, but I can't really speak to it in doing it in Quarkus.
Yeah, I don't think there's any extensions that relate to mutation testing that have a Quarkus integration. I don't think.
Well, PyTest should be almost working, but mutation testing is mostly for, or at least as I see it, is mostly for unit testing. So actually Quarkus is not necessarily involved at that level. You really want to test your business logic using mutations. If you start calling REST endpoint with mutations, can be interesting, but might be slightly more tricky. And you can just use Copilot to generate your code. That is almost mutation testing. But yeah, so for unit test, it would work out of the box. For the rest, might need some integration.
Oh, there's Laurent in here chiming in. Yeah, I haven't played with it. And then you write your unit test and you just say, hey, I'm testing these methods. And in this case for gRPC, it's a synchronous message. And what happens under the covers, we're just generating them in on the file system because we don't have a broker. Oops, not Quarkus. Are they here somewhere? No, I haven't run it. So they would generate you'd have a Pact file up for each service. So like fights to locations, fights to heroes, fights to villains. You'd have all those Pact tests. So that's contract testing in a nutshell. If you want to learn more about contract testing, Holly and I have a whole talk. We spend a whole hour talking about it. This is where it starts to get interesting. So I am totally not a UI person at all. But I've really gotten to love Quinoa, and especially Quinoa with Playwright. So if you're not familiar with Quinoa is if you have a user interface like a single page app written in some React, Vue, Angular, pick your favorite UI framework, allowing you to serve that from and package it within your Quarkus application without having to install all the Quarkus dependencies. So in the superheroes, that is our UI service, right? So we've got a UI service, which is very Java light. It doesn't have a lot of Java in it. Source, main, Java, just some environmental stuff like to pass parameters and whatnot. But there's not a lot of Quarkus stuff in here. The meat of this application is actually React, which you wrote, Holly, and you converted over to React from Angular. So thank you for that. And there's lots of awesome tests in there. So we have our package.json, there's the app, there's the fight list, there's the fight, and then there's the jest tests that go with it. So being able to run these tests from the Java code. So you've got the jest library being able to run the JavaScript tests. If you look at the way I kind of did this, if you look at the package.json, so there's a script for running, starting, building, testing, and then running coverage. So I can run the test package with coverage. And what that means is I have, I forget which, some coverage library that JavaScript has. I'm not a JavaScript person, but I figured this out once. There's a JavaScript package, which when you run jest will actually compute the coverage metrics and save them to a file. And then in my pom.xml, where's it here? Sorry, my screen is like really tiny. I created a separate Maven profile for doing the integration for doing coverage. Where is it here? Yeah, here it is. So it runs the Jacoco Maven plugin, from the UI side or from the Java side, and then it also runs the report goal, and it combines that with the coverage. So when I run, if I look at like my CI action here for running Sonar, here's here, Sonar. So for the UI, when the UI runs, it's actually going to configure Sonar to pull the source code from source main Java as well as source main web UI lcov. That's the JavaScript library for coverage. It's going to combine the coverage generated by Jest as well as the coverage and the reports generated from Surefire and Failsafe. So it combines everything into one package and sends it off to Sonar to get scanned. And the way it gets scanned, if you look in the testing package here, is there's this. Sorry, which one is it here? IT. So there's this. I created a separate profile because I use it more than once. But Quinoa has this test profile where you can update, and I'm using Microx here again, where I use Microx to serve, so to act as the fight service, which is the backing service for the UI. You can use Microx to do that, and then you set this profile. When you set enable, it'll actually, the test will run and it'll bootstrap the UI, and then you can start it'll actually run the UI, and you can start doing things like, where is it here? My web UI. it'll run the jest test. So it'll start your Quarkus server. It'll bootstrap the application, the React. It'll run all the Node.js npm stuff. It'll start the npm server, and then it'll run all the jest tests, right? So that you can test, you write your UI tests, or if you use this enable and run tests, it's this enable and run tests, which will run all your jest tests. This other profile just runs the you just bootstraps the UI. So this will actually run the test goal in your package.json. So it's a good and easy way to do that.
It's really, really cool.
Yeah. The other kind of cool thing is if we start looking at something like Playwright, for example. So I don't have it in the UI, but like the villain service, for example, if I go into villains, and I know we're just about out of time, but this is very cool. So if I run the villain service just in dev mode, just so I can show you the UI and what it does. And I've started to use Playwright a lot, like using LLMs and chatbots and whatnot. So like being able to interact with your application in a browser, but without the browser, as a user would interact with the browser and pointing and clicking and looking for responses and whatnot. So if I run this, so it's just a very simple UI, it shows all the villains. It shows I can collapse and expand, and then I can got this little filter box, and I can look at who's Darth, Darth Sidious, Darth Vader. It does a filter. It's very simple, but you can see where this is going, how you could use this thing. You can basically find elements on the page. If I run my test here, so if I say villain resource, is it in the tests? No, it's in UI resource tests. So my UI resource test is a Quarkus test, again, with the pinning stuff, but it also says with Playwright, it'll actually record a video of the browser interaction. And I put the slow-mo on it just to slow it down a little bit so you can actually see the video is not like half of a millisecond long and actually see what it's doing because it goes really fast. But you can actually see it's going to load the page. It's going to do some verification on the page. It has the right title. It's going to find the grid. It's going to do that the grid has the right elements, and then it's going to like do the filter. And so if I run this test, I'm just going to run this one test. UI resource test. So when it runs, you won't see anything on the screen, but once it's done, it's actually going to record a video as it does its thing, and it'll save the video.
That's really cool. I was going to say, if for people who don't know Playwright, that if you like Selenium, then you'll like Playwright, but actually nobody likes Selenium, so that's probably not the right comparison. But if you know Selenium and hate Selenium, then you should look at Playwright.
Yeah, so let's see here. So here's this. So I'm just going to open this here. So I don't know which test this was, but you can see it. Oh, it just loaded the page and did something. If I come back and I open this other one, this one's 8 seconds long. It's doing something. All right, not that one. Must be this one. Yeah, see, it filtered for Darth Vader, and it clicked the filter button. So you can actually record what it's doing.
Which is, that's so useful, because so often with this kind of testing, the nightmare is debugging it and it fails. And you're like, why did it fail? It should work.
Yeah. So I think that's all the time I got. I think I'm over time here. I've got tons of other stuff that I can show. So like in some of my personal projects, like when I'm working on, like I said, some AI stuff, and I have, the typical chatbot, you can use Playwright to load your browser, find the button to open the chatbot, to put some text in, to wait for the chatbot to respond, and then get the text that it worked with and make sure it does the right kind of thing and whatnot. So those are the kinds of tests, like for those types of applications, I write a lot more of Playwright tests than I do unit tests, because I find them super helpful.
Really, really cool and useful. Thank you very
Yeah.
much, Eric.
Yeah, so I skipped over a whole bunch of stuff, but there's lots of other stuff in there.
Any
And there are new things coming too, because before the break, I started working on how to test or evaluate AI applications. So it's slightly different because you cannot be sure at 100% it's going to work. So it's an evaluation framework more than a testing framework. But it's a JUnit 5. It's a JUnit 5 extension plugin. Plugin that you can use with Quarkus.
Yeah, and that's going to end up in this. So this repo that's here is still under work. So this is my talk for JFocus that I'm working on.
Isn't that next week?
It's in a couple of weeks. So yeah, we're kind of behind the 8 ball a little bit. You know how so I'm working on this with Oleg from Docker. So there's a lot of stuff, like everything that I've kind of talked about is in here, as well as like LangChain. I've got lots of different guardrails, and Clement's been super helpful. Like on our back channel Slack, I've been asking him all kinds of questions over the last couple of weeks. All that's the answers to all those questions that I've been asking are in here. So like being able to, like, this is a web UI that has a asynchronous chatbot. So there's Playwright in here. There's I've got, so you see, I've only got one test for my service layer, but I've got the Playwright tests. And this actually uses MailPit. So if you're not familiar with MailPit, if your application needs to send emails, MailPit has a Quarkus extension where it starts a backend email server, and then you can interact with it. So if I do an action in my service layer, I can then connect to MailPit and say, hey, did you actually get this email that I found? You can search the mailbox and search the contents of the email and whatnot. It's pretty cool. But then it's got all tests. I've got a bunch of different guardrails that do different things that, like, is the thing polite? Does it have the right information in the body? Did the LLM hallucinate or not? Is it good? And I've got all kinds of tests for all that stuff too.
Yeah, I really want to see this talk, and I'm not going to be at JFocus, but I will look forward to the recording of it.
Yeah, so that's all I got.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Anything else? Any other questions? Super last minute questions? Anything else that Clement has been writing?
Clement has saved me from a lot of work.
Wow. And I built another test framework just for the case I'm doing right now. So to do what I'm doing, I started and said, no, it's too painful to test. So I wrote the test framework to test the thing I'm doing. Which is kind of procrastinating, like, I don't want to do this, so let's write a test framework to test it.
Yeah, so that's exactly like what a lot of us do. If like, I want to write a blog, so I need to write like a blogging framework before I can write the blog.
Well, make a lot of sense, right? So
yeah, completely.
And we're all engineers, so like, you want to start your own website, it's like, oh no, I don't want to use one that's already out of the box. I want to build my own, right?
Clearly.
And here we go.
Yep, cool. Well, thank you very much, Eric. And we will see you all next week.
Bye.